So we're extremely pleased that she could come and speak to us today. She has over 18 years in the RSPCA Farm Animals Department, which she's been head of since 2003. And today she's going to talk to us about the RSPCA's approach to development and implementation of farm animal welfare policy. So, Julia Wrathall.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. It's interesting, I noticed my talk is in the section on the ethics and politics of farm animal welfare, but interestingly I think it could have fitted just as well into the other section on economics and practice of farm animal welfare, and that probably I think gives some indication of the fact that in order to make improvements and secure change, whether it be in practice or in attitude, it's very important that we try and approach it from a number of different perspectives and deal with all aspects and all levels. So hopefully as I go through my talk, you'll get some insight into, firstly, how the RSPCA goes about developing its policies on farm animal welfare, but also how we then gather the evidence to support that or to help shape it, analyse that evidence, prioritise it, and then I think very importantly and with most difficulty we go about implementing it in a wide range of ways and in an awful lot of different sectors. So I'll try and give some flavour of that, and I will try to keep to time. I think I've written rather an ambitious set of slides. I may have to rush through at the end, but as you'll be able to see the talk afterwards and refer to it, hopefully that won't cause too many problems. I'm going to stand slightly nearer to the...
Sure, you're okay.
Yeah, there we go, that's fine. So in terms of the key points of RSPCA policy development and implementation, the Society has a vision and a mission, sets policies within each of the areas of animal usage and also strategic objectives. And just as a matter of interest, the organisation is currently undertaking a full review of its overarching strategy, and the results of that review will be announced in the summer. So we're doing a root and branch review of everything we do and the way we approach different aspects of animal welfare. But the vision relates to, and I can read it out, a world in which all humans respect and live in harmony with members of the animal kingdom. So a very aspirational vision. Mission. The policies are much more specific and, as I say, relate to the areas of animal usage. The Society takes a very evidence-based approach to the development of its policy, but also its activities, its practices, and its position on a wide range of issues. We're very aware, because we implement in practice our policies, we're very aware of the challenges posed by implementation of those policies, and I'll come to those a little bit later when I give a few examples. Putting that theory into practice, into reality. We're also very aware of the importance and the need and the value of approaching different target audiences in different ways, of giving great consideration to how we elicit the greatest change, how we implement the policies to best effect amongst different sectors, and again I'll be able to cover that a little bit. So looking first of all at how we develop policy, we use a wide range of sources of evidence. Certainly emphasis is placed on scientific research and information, validated research, peer-reviewed, published ideally, but also robust practical trial data where we are confident about the results, it's controlled, we are able to be confident that the data is really telling us something. Also direct personal experience and evidence over a number of years. Colleagues and I have a great deal of personal experience that we can bring to bear. Also, we take account of independent expert reports and reviews, for example from EFSA and FORC. And also expert opinion from others, professional advice from those who have a great deal of experience and knowledge and expertise in a particular area. And increasingly, we look at welfare assessments. Now I know there's going to be a talk that will cover that in more detail later today, so I won't go into it in detail myself. But suffice it to say that the RSPCA now is moving towards, and has indeed adopted, a welfare assessment, a welfare outcome assessment methodology when trying to assess the welfare state of animals on farm. We're working with the Soil Association and Bristol University to develop what we hope will be a universally applied methodology and core measures of welfare. So that provides us with a really important evidence source when considering the welfare state of animals and how to improve it. But we also look at other sources. All these areas are useful and important and can provide us with good information that can help to shape our policies. So, of course, it's important that we evaluate the evidence that we're looking at rather than taking it at face value. So we go about that in a number of ways. The nature of the source I've just talked about. The independence is important. Bias can happen either intentionally or unintentionally. From our point of view, in order to ensure that a source is robust, its independence is an important criteria. And also how many sources are telling us the same thing, how many different kinds of evidence bases are giving us the same information or similar information. That again is a good marker for us. And also how much data is available over what time period, what's the sample size, and so forth. All pretty important stuff. And the robustness of analysis. I know we're all bound to be rather nervous of statistics and what they're really telling us. I think it's very important that when a conclusion is drawn by another body or individual or group, that we look at the way in which they have analysed the data before simply accepting their conclusions. And the opinion of others as to the robustness of an evidence source is also important too. So if you have a number of expert, experienced, knowledgeable people also believing that an evidence source is of value and robust, that's a good marker too. So it's quite a wide-ranging process that we go through in order to identify best sources of evidence from our perspective that are most likely to lead us to developing the right policy from an animal welfare point of view. But of course, we don't always have the information available to us. The science isn't always there. The data may not be available. And in such cases, we have to consider other approaches, and certainly extrapolation from similar species or situations, and comparison with best practice. I'll come more to practical experience and what's happening out in the field, so to speak, quite literally, a little bit later. But comparing best innovation on farm with where we are across the board and looking at how to approach that is also important. And using our own primary research and experience. Over the years, the RSPCA has commissioned a number of farm animal welfare related research projects and also worked with farmers to undertake trial work on farm as well, so that can be used when there isn't anything else available. And I think a really interesting area from our perspective, one we've looked into quite recently to work alongside the welfare outcome assessment programme that we're developing, is the use of qualitative behavioural assessment. And I don't know how many of you are aware of that, Francois Svenwolfelder's work, but looking at actually trying to get a sense of the animal's emotions, how the animal is feeling, trying to get a sense from body language and behaviour what the animal can tell you. And I think use of that alongside other validated approaches such as welfare outcome assessment and application of resource type standards is a very useful pointer towards identifying perhaps where something isn't quite right, something needs to be improved, or equally identifying where conditions are good and the animal's needs are being met. So I think just what I would call justifiable anthropomorphism is valid. As a scientist, it's something throughout my early career that I was told was not to be trusted by a scientific person, but I think it's certainly justifiable alongside other validated approaches. And certainly the RSPCA is positive about that kind of approach. And the use of informed prudence where there is a concern that may be an animal welfare issue, where there's a concern that perhaps a practice should be avoided, there isn't a hard, firm data about the effect on animals, then the precautionary principle needs to be applied to ensure that unless and until information comes forward to illustrate that there really isn't a problem, then we need to be careful about applying the practice. And of course good old common sense, which is often overlooked and seen as not scientifically proven, but in the absence of other information can be very useful. And we've just had a talk all about ethics, and so I won't go into that area, but the RSPCA is very mindful of the importance of taking into account ethical issues rather than just hard facts on welfare science. And I suppose a good example of where we do apply such an approach would be in the fundamental importance of the life of an individual animal. I mean, for example, one could say that the killing of newborn animals that are surplus to requirements, maybe dairy bull calves or laying hen breeds, the males from laying hen breeds killed at birth or just after hatching. Now, if the killing is done very well, there may not be a welfare problem in terms of the animal's suffering, pain and distress. However, it is wastage of life. It's an animal born simply for another purpose, only to be killed as soon as it's born. So there are a number of issues in farming that may not lead to suffering of the animal in the sense that we tend to define it, but can lead to other issues that we must consider. And certainly we do take those issues into account when developing our policies. And just a few key areas here that we would identify as being those where we lack evidence or don't have enough evidence at the moment, feel we need more. And certainly over the years, until quite recently, little attention has been paid to the mental or psychological welfare, the emotional state of farm animals in particular. I mean, it's interesting how it's a whole other issue which I can't go into now, but the differential treatment of a pet animal and the acceptance for many years by the general public that a dog has an emotional life. But if you apply that to a chicken or a pig, people in general see that in a very different way. But certainly I think things are moving on, but still we need to find out a lot more about how to measure this and how to understand it such that we're meeting the animal's needs in these areas. And also others such as physiological states, chronic hunger in broiler breeders, the parent birds of the meat chickens, who are very often feed restricted to quite a severe degree. But again, there is little robust data giving us a firm indicator of just how much they are suffering because of that physiological state. And also, we tend to treat farm animals in particular as groups. So it's a herd of cattle or a flock of sheep. But within that flock or herd, the individuals will vary. And how we try to take account of that when deciding what is best for a group of animals is, again, something that I think we need to do a lot more work on. And unusual farm species that are always coming along. And also, perhaps more mundane but important issues such as robust national data on the health of the national dairy herd or the health of the national chicken flock. So these are areas where we still need more information, so we have to apply those other criteria when trying to develop policy in these areas. So that's how we develop policy. And moving on now to implementation. You can imagine the RSPCA, which covers all species of animals and works in many, many different ways to try and improve the welfare of those animals, needs to try and apply and implement its policy in a variety of very different ways and through a variety of different initiatives and activities, including through our own activities, our own programmes of work. And the RSPCA, nearly 20 years ago now, began to develop species-specific welfare standards for farm animals. And these are primarily applied through our own assurance scheme, Freedom Food. So that's a very practical way in which we can try to reflect policy and apply policy in the real world. And I'll come back to the real world a little bit later because it's an extremely challenging place to be when you know where you really want to be. And as I said, we're now applying welfare outcome measures and a protocol through the Freedom Food Scheme as well. So we set resource standards, ways in which the animals should be kept, in a way that we hope reflects our policy, but also we try to measure what the outcomes are for those animals. And of course policy helps us to develop a position on pretty much every animal issue that's thrown our way, and we do get asked about every single animal issue that arises through media or other places. So that can be reactively and proactively. And then a few other areas where policy is our guiding light as to how we approach things. Advice, training, campaigns I'll come back to, advocacy and lobbying of government in line with our policy. Again, I'll mention that in an example. And information sources. Also prioritisation of activities. As I said, everything gets thrown our way. We would love to do everything. We obviously cannot do that. So one way in which we have to try to decide what we do is to prioritise our activities and initiatives. Clearly our policies help us to do that, but equally we do have some evaluation criteria which help us to decide which are the most important areas for us to work on. Where should we best focus our resource, human and financial? And these would include the following. Some are going to be very obvious and used by many, I'm sure. Severity scale, frequency and duration of suffering. Also achievability, the level of impact we can have if we get involved, the likelihood of us being able to achieve implementation of our policy if we take up this issue, if we try to work in this area. Also importantly, is someone else doing a good job already in that area? Do we really need to get involved, or is our resource best placed elsewhere? Is it like an iconic issue that will perhaps help to highlight the cause of animal welfare? So we should still work in that area, we should still highlight it, even if we know that achieving it is going to prove extremely difficult, if not impossible under current circumstances. And of course for a charity who relies on the goodwill and support of others, we do need to take on board our supporters' views. What do they think is important? What do they feel that the organisation should be doing? So there's a whole collection of evaluation criteria that we use in order to decide which activities we're going to get involved in, how are we going to try and reflect policy and in which areas. So a few other considerations when we are trying to implement our top-line policies in reality is that we will often need to translate our aspiration, where we'd really like to be, our strategic objective in that area, into a form that can be understood, into a form that is applicable in the circumstances that we're talking about. Can it actually be undertaken on farm at this time? Can it actually be applied in practice with success and maintained? And a lot of those real-world practical considerations will be these. And just to pick at some, again, will be obvious, but others I think are very important and lead us to consider the approach we take. Not only which issue do we work on, but what approach do we take in order to try to achieve our ultimate aim of reflecting policy in practice. And timing and timescales and the degree of change needed are very important. So whether it's, for example, taking the farming industry, where are they now? Where are the vast majority of farms now in terms of applying a particular system or practice? Where would we like them to be? How big is that gap? How likely is it that we'll be able to get people to change within different time frames? And I think another one is very important, knowledge transfer. How much information do we need to give to farmers or abattoirs or whoever it might be? And I think that's often perhaps not properly considered, the way in which you communicate information and knowledge, the way in which you try to encourage or help or support, or indeed to push. So it's carrot and stick as well, which of those is going to work in a particular instance. but also just making sure that there is proper understanding and knowledge about what's needed, about animal welfare itself. Those are really key elements that I think, you know, a guiding principle for us is never assume. It's absolutely fatal to assume anything about anybody or any sector. Make sure there's clear understanding before you start. And attitudes and culture are important. There are certain practices which are very traditional, which are seen as almost untouchable. And equally there will be some cultural beliefs that will lead certain community groups to apply a certain practice. And those are very, very difficult and sensitive areas to deal with. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't get involved, but one does need to give very careful thought to how to approach those. So, with all that in mind, I thought it might be easiest to give you a few examples of how we reflect policy in practice, how we try and implement policy, so that you can get a sense of the process in practice. So I've chosen three different areas. One is development of the RSPCA welfare standards, which, as I mentioned, are primarily implemented through our assurance scheme, Prudence. So developing those and implementing them so that they reflect policy. Campaigning for improvements in farm animal welfare in a way that reflects our policy and helps us to implement our policy, encourages others to implement the RSPCA policy. And also law and legislation, which is clearly a huge area, a very important area still, despite the fact that a lot of work now and a lot of improvements in farm animal welfare are being achieved through the marketplace, through non-governmental approaches. Law remains a very important part. It's the baseline below which society as a whole accepts we must not fall in terms of animal welfare. So it still sets that baseline, it's still important. But of course law is nothing without enforcement. One can have wonderful laws, but if they're not properly enforced, then they're not worth the paper they're written on, or the computer they're typed on these days. So again, I'll just touch on that and how we try to ensure that there is enforcement of law where law does reflect RSPCA policy, because some law is actually pretty good if it's properly enforced. If it's properly implemented and enforced, it is actually at quite a good level. So taking the first one, RSPCA welfare standards for farm animals, and looking at our welfare standards for pigs, and considering how we've been on quite a journey in terms of the environment in which the pigs farrow, the sows give birth. And many of you will be aware that it's still very common industry practice in indoor systems for sows to be kept in farrowing crates at the time of giving birth. These are very small pens in which the sow will give birth and be kept for the full pre-weaning period, which is 3 to 4 weeks, with her piglets. Usually very barren, without any bedding, usually very, very small and very, very tight. So, having a look at what the RSPCA policy is in relation to that kind of confinement system. We're opposed to all forms of farming that deprive the animals of the opportunity to indulge in natural behaviour. Now, a sow it has a very strong drive to nest build just prior to farrowing. She also wants to move around a few days after farrowing. And so clearly a farrowing crate restricts those natural behaviours quite significantly. Very widespread use, as I said, of the farrowing crate. The aim is to reduce the number of piglets crushed. Until very recently, I'll come back to that, the information coming from research, the information coming from practical experience and on-farm trials was that piglets could be, or piglet mortality by crushing could be reduced by use of confinement at the time of farrowing. But clearly the welfare cons are very much related to the sow, her behaviour, her confinement, and her lack of comfort in a very bare, barren crate. Now, in 1994, when the Freedom Food Scheme was launched and the RSPCA launched its first sets of standards, the RSPCA standards permitted what you might call enhanced farrowing crates. So a sow could be confined in a pen, but had to be given bedding and nest building material and a larger crate than standard. However, she was still confined for the full pre-weaning period. That approach, although one could say certainly not meeting our policy, was as a result of analysis of available evidence and information at the time, the research, expert opinion, and also what we were seeing in commercial practice at the time. Very, very few examples of indoor free farrowing in commercial farms. And it was the precautionary principle from the point of view of piglet welfare. Now, a few years after that, so that was 1994, a few years after that, new research was undertaken, including some funded by the RSPCA. We supported farmers with innovations on farm and viable alternatives that were managing to achieve comparable levels of pig mortality were identified. So in order to progress our standards towards truly reflecting our policy, we undertook a number of activities. All those very useful, I've been through before, are evidence sources for us. And then in 2008, DEFRA put up some money to fund a big research project that was looking not only at the welfare of the piglets, but also the welfare of the sow and the commercial viability of alternative free farrowing environments in indoor systems. And we were very much involved on the steering group of that project. And as a result of all that, we took a stepwise approach to introducing completely free farrowing into our standards. Initially in 1999, when we first began to look at the innovations on farm and some of the new science came through, we required that sows were released from crates after only 5 days post-farrowing, because the evidence indicated it was the first 2 or 3 days of life where the piglets were most vulnerable to crushing and could be most protected by confinement. But following the pig safe work and working with other producers, indoor producers, we are now in a situation where under our standards and within the Freedom Food Scheme, everybody is free farrowing whether they're indoor or outdoors. And so in effect, we now have our own practices, our own standards, fully reflecting our policy on expression of natural behaviour for sows. Second example relates to campaigning. And I've chosen here a very topical one on providing farmed ducks with access to water. Not water for drinking, but water for bathing in. And a little bit of background, that's the policy that you've just seen, same policy. Clear evidence from research, from practical experience on farm, from producers who are managing to do it, and expert opinion. The ducks have a very strong drive to have full body access to water, not just to dip their heads in, not just to drink, but to get into, in order to be able to express key water-related behaviours. However, the law doesn't even really cover specifically the welfare of farm ducks, and industry standards, there's now a new industry assurance scheme which covers most farm ducks. The industry standards do not require full body access to water, simply for heads to be able to put into water. The RSPCA welfare standards for ducks do require full body access to open water based on previous research over many years, practical experience and expert opinion. So how have we gone about trying to secure behaviour change across the industry? And we've taken a number of approaches. New research was undertaken, commissioned by us, funded by a Tubney Charitable Trust, finished it a year or so ago, which was to try and examine how best to give farm ducks in a commercial environment access to water. We also looked at case studies of farms who were managing it, and then launched a campaign to try to target each of these groups. Consumers, in order to raise their awareness of the fact that, firstly, ducks were farmed. Many consumers in surveys thought that duck that they were buying in the supermarket, or more likely in the restaurant, was wild. They didn't even know ducks were farmed on a large scale. But also raising this issue of the fact that ducks don't actually have access to full body access to water, which surprised about 80% of the public. They were amazed at that. And calling them to action, asking them to put pressure on their retailer to source and sell only duck meat from ducks that have been given full body access. Liaising with producers, a very important part of it. Practical demonstrations, advice from their peers, those who actually are giving full body access. How does it work? It can work in practice, a really important part of trying to persuade farmers, because often there's fear of change, and hearing it from your peers, seeing it in practice helps. A very, very powerful group, retailers, so we've targeted retailers through meetings, but also through awareness raising of the welfare aspects of failing to give full body access, but also that pressure coming from consumers, actually saying, you know, we can't believe that you're doing this, we can't believe you're selling duck meat from systems without full body access. And of course government, that's England and Wales governments, providing evidence, a lot of advocacy and lobbying, but to date we have no specific legislation, and the codes are in, shall we say, in significant need of updating in order to reflect best knowledge and latest science and practical innovation in this area. The outcome so far is that since the start of the campaign, we now have another major retailer, and that's Tesco, who've decided they will now require their suppliers to give ducks full body access for some of their range. So we've had a movement there, and that was very much based on them examining the evidence and the information as well as the pressure. So we're beginning to move more towards putting our policy into practice. Where I'm over time, I've got one more example. Have I got time for that?
Yes, you've got 2 minutes for this.
Oh, right, okay. And this one is about law enforcement. How do we ensure that where the law does reflect RSPCA policy, it is actually going to be enforced properly and is being enforced properly? And what I've chosen there is a very long-standing issue for the RSPCA, a long-standing concern. That is, not just for meat chickens, but for many farm animals, the issue of selective breeding for enhanced productivity. And I've chosen meat chickens because they are probably one of the perhaps most notorious species in terms of the effects of genetic selection on certain aspects of their welfare. So the background is the RSPCA policy is that we are opposed to selection of animals for enhanced productivity where this causes them welfare problems, based on the evidence from science, practical experience and expert opinion. The legislation covering this area also states that if an animal isn't going to be able to live reasonably without detrimental effects on health or welfare, then it shouldn't be produced, whether it's through genotype or phenotype. So in effect, the law is pretty much in line with the RSPCA policy. So I think that's a good example where, you know, the law is where we would like to see it. I think the difficulty for us is the enforcement of that law, perhaps the interpretation of it, but certainly the enforcement. Lots of clear evidence, a large body of evidence that meat chickens suffer as a result, or certainly an association with fast growth rates. So a very fast growing breed is likely to suffer in a number of ways because of that enhanced growth. Lots of information indicating that. And clearly the way you keep a chicken affects its welfare too, but there's an inherent problem with certain breeds that are very fast growing. The RSPCA welfare standards for chickens were the first to set a ceiling on genetic growth rate potential. So we're not just saying birds can't grow faster than this if you want them to be in our freedom food scheme. We actually said it's about the genetic growth rate potential. So that helped to avoid restriction of growth through feed restriction. So someone could have met a standard just saying they mustn't grow more quickly than this by restricting feed. What we wanted was the genetic potential to be restricted. So I think that's a very important point. So our standards set that. But the difficulty we had in trying to highlight the problem of perhaps the need for greater enforcement of that legislation was the lack of objective and consistently assessed growth rate potential data for specific breeds. Each of the three major breeding companies of broilers have their own way of assessing the growth rate potential. There's no consistency. So it's very, very difficult to compare breeds and to get a true independent picture of how their welfare is affected by growth rate. So we have that problem. And also the welfare outcome data just starting to be applied, just starting to come through, is rather mixed. And therefore didn't provide us with a good, sound, robust evidence base with which to go to government. Reported lack of commercial viability of the birds with lower genetic growth rate potential also caused problems within industry and trying to encourage them to use slow-growing breeds. So how did we go about progressing this issue? What are we doing now? We're in the process of doing this. Obviously looking at a literature review to try and identify the most appropriate welfare outcome measures to use to measure the welfare of broiler chickens. So we've certainly in the process of doing that. Lots of advice from relevant academic experts to develop what we call the welfare assessment protocol for different breeds of chicken. How are we going to compare different breeds of chicken? And we've now undertaken a couple of pilot trials on an independent assessment centre. I think the independence is very important, where we can run different breeds through the centre, measure the welfare outcomes, and come out with a true comparison of welfare of different breeds growing at different rates. Data gathering of outcomes for different breeds on farm within a commercial environment, analysis of all the evidence to develop our own standard and position on this, and then use of all of that to raise the issue of lack of enforcement of that bit of the legislation saying unless the animal can be kept in a way, reasonably expected to be kept in a way that doesn't affect its health and welfare because of its genotype or phenotype, then you shouldn't breed that animal. And we hope, and as I say, I think it'll be really interesting to see, but it may well be that some breeds do actually breach the legislation, so the production of certain breeds of broiler are probably breaching that legislation. And we hope to be able to highlight that and show that through our analysis. And so the aim is that our policy and the legislation are being applied in practice, but we need to be forced to do that. So our ultimate aim is that's what we're aiming for through implementation of our policy. And I'm going to be very anthropomorphic. I think that pig is definitely smiling. And if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to take them.
Thank you very much.